It was a Tuesday morning like any other in Fairhaven. The air was crisp, the sky is serene blue, and the suburban streets were framed by well-tended lawns and towering oaks, their leaves just beginning to hint at the golden hues of autumn. Officer Ethan Tate cruised through the neighborhood in his patrol car, his window cracked open to let in the morning chill. Fairhaven was his favorite route, a place of predictability and calm, where the houses were as polished as the cars parked in their driveways. This was a community where things made sense to him. He turned a corner, catching sight of a sleek black SUV parked just outside a cafe. It was the kind of car you didn't often see in Fairhaven, where practicality ruled over showmanship. Standing by the vehicle was a black woman in a tailored blazer, her phone pressed to her ear as she rummaged through her bag. Ethan slowed instinctively. Something about the scene, her presence, perhaps felt out of place. He watched her for a moment, a flicker of unease creeping into his thoughts. She was well dressed, poised, her SUV spotless and gleaming in the sunlight. By all accounts, she appeared to belong here just as much as anyone else. Yet, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't. He had no evidence, of course. Just a vague sense. Something he told himself was intuition, but that, in truth, he rarely questioned. Pulling his cruiser to the curb, Ethan stepped out and adjusted his belt. His boots crunched against the pavement as he approached her, his shadow falling across her face. She looked up, her expression neutral but alert. Her conversation paused mid-sentence. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" The woman blinked, seemingly surprised by the question. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ethan folded his arms, glancing briefly at the cafe behind her. "This is private property. Do you have permission to park here?" The question hung in the air, its weight disproportionate to the mundane nature of the situation. The woman's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face before she spoke. "I'm meeting someone for coffee," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I wasn't aware parking here was an issue." Ethan studied her, his gaze narrowing. She spoke with a confidence that grated on him, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the way she didn't seem intimidated or the precision of her words. Measured and steady, he decided to push further. "I'll need to see your ID," he said, the words coming out sharper than intended. "Why?" she asked, her tone still even, though now tinged with irritation. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because I asked. Please hand over your ID." For a moment, she didn't move, her eyes locked on his. Then, with a measured sigh, she reached into her bag and retrieved her wallet. She handed him her driver's license without a word, her composure unnerving him more than defiance might have. Ethan glanced at the card briefly. Her name, Jordan Ellis, meant nothing to him before slipping it into his pocket. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. "What for?" she asked, her patience clearly fraying. "I've done nothing wrong." "You're resisting now," he snapped. "Step away from the vehicle, or I'll have no choice but to detain you." For the first time, her calm broke. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low, steady, and laden with something he couldn't quite place. But Ethan wasn't listening. His pride and authority demanded obedience. And in that moment, he acted without thought. Grabbing her arm, he spun her around and cuffed her wrists. She didn't resist, though her jaw tightened as she stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. The drive to the station was silent, though Ethan's mind was anything but. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that her calm demeanor had been a mask for something sinister. Yet, a small, unwelcome voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. When they arrived at the station, Jordan said nothing as he led her inside, her cuffs clinking softly with each step. The desk officer looked up as they approached, his eyes flickering between Ethan and the woman in cuffs. "What's this?" the officer asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "Picked her up near the cafe," Ethan said, his tone dismissive. "Suspicious activity." The desk officer nodded slowly, taking her ID and scanning it into the system. Moments later, his face changed, a flicker of recognition, then unease. Tate," the officer said quietly, leaning closer. "You might want to take another look at her ID." "What for?" Ethan asked, irritation flaring. Just trust me. The desk officer turned the screen toward him. Ethan leaned in, and for the first time, truly looked at the badge and credentials. His stomach dropped. Supervisory Special Agent Jordan Ellis. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room seemed to close in around him. He glanced at her, but her expression remained unreadable. Calm, even as she stood there in handcuffs. I told you, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to reverberate through the room. You made a mistake. Ethan's world tilted, and in that moment, the quiet routine of Fairhaven shattered. Nothing, he realized, would ever be the same. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the Fairhaven Police Department, casting soft stripes of light across the linoleum floor. Inside, the air was heavy, not with the usual bustle of reports and radio chatter, but with the unspoken tension that always accompanied the hint of scandal. Ethan Tate sat stiffly in the small break room, staring at the coffee in his hands. It had gone cold, but he hadn't noticed. His mind churned with what had unfolded that morning. Across the station, whispers had started to ripple. Officers gathered in quiet clusters, speaking in hushed tones that would cease the moment Ethan passed by. Some avoided his gaze altogether. Others gave him lingering looks, not of judgment exactly, but something close to curiosity, even unease. They knew, somehow, they always knew. In Captain Rebecca Haynes's office, the mood was no better. She stood behind her desk, arms crossed, staring down at Ethan like a school principal about to reprimand a wayward student. She was a measured woman, her expression calm but steely, the weight of leadership visible in the faint lines on her face. What were you thinking, Tate? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Did you even look at her ID? Ethan hesitated, his hand tightening around the mug. He began, but the words faltered. What could he say? That he'd seen what he wanted to see. That the doubt he'd felt, fleeting as it was, hadn't been enough to stop him? Haynes sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. Supervisory Special Agent Jordan Ellis, she said, the name deliberate, as though its weight alone might drive the point home. An FBI agent, detained on suspicion of, what exactly? Standing by her car? She looked out of place. Ethan said quietly, though even as the words left his mouth, he hated how they sounded. Haynes raised an eyebrow. Out of place? In Fairhaven? Ethan didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for them both. Blank. Blank. Down the hall, Agent Jordan Ellis sat calmly in an interrogation room. Her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. The cuffs had been removed, but the faint marks on her wrists remained. A quiet testament to the morning's events. She wasn't angry, not outwardly. Anger required energy, and at this moment, she was conserving hers. This was not her first encounter with a man like Ethan Tate. It likely wouldn't be her last. When the door opened, Captain Haynes stepped in, her expression carefully controlled. She sat across from Jordan, setting a folder on the table between them. Agent Ellis, Haynes began, her voice professional, almost apologetic. I want to start by saying that this incident does not reflect the values of this department. Jordan tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes steady. Doesn't it? The question lingered in the room. Haynes hesitated, her resolve faltering just for a moment. This is not how we operate, Haynes said finally, though the words felt rehearsed even to her own ears. Officer Tate has been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. There will be an investigation. Jordan nodded, her expression unchanged. And what happens after the investigation? She asked. A slap on the wrist? A quiet reassignment? Haynes leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. That's not up to me. No, Jordan said quietly. It's not, but it is up to someone. And if it isn't handled here, it'll be handled elsewhere. The room went quiet again. Outside, the station buzzed with its usual rhythms. But here, in this sterile space, time seemed to slow. Haynes studied Jordan for a moment, searching for something she couldn't quite name. She saw the strength in the agent's posture, the restraint in her tone. This was not a woman who would be easily dismissed. Blank. In the break room, Ethan remained seated, staring at the same cup of coffee as though it might offer some answer. He'd told himself a dozen different justifications since he'd walked into the station with Jordan Ellis in cuffs. She had been combative, hadn't she? She hadn't cooperated fully, but those excuses felt paper thin now, unraveling under the weight of what he'd seen on her badge. Nearby, Lieutenant Rosa Martinez leaned against the counter, her arms crossed as she watched him. She wasn't one for small talk, and Ethan didn't expect her to offer comfort. Still, her silence was louder than any question she might have asked. "You've messed up," she said finally, her voice low. It wasn't accusatory, nor was it kind. It was simply a fact. Ethan didn't look up. "I didn't know who she was." Martinez shook her head. "That's the problem, Tate. You didn't bother to find out." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because they were harsh but because they were true. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Martinez walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Blank. Blank. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows of Fairhaven grew long, the precinct remained a microcosm of conflicting emotions. Some officers sympathized with Ethan, blaming what had happened on a world that they felt no longer allowed them to do their jobs without scrutiny. Others, like Martinez, saw it differently. "It's not scrutiny that's the problem," she had said to a group gathered near the lockers. "It's the lack of it." Ethan didn't hear her. He was already on his way out. His badge and gun surrendered, his suspension in effect. As he stepped into the cool night air, he glanced back at the station, its familiar silhouette now strangely alien. He didn't know what awaited him, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Inside, Jordan Ellis gathered her belongings, her movements deliberate and unhurried. When she stepped out into the night, the air felt lighter somehow, though the weight of the day lingered. She slid into her car, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. It wasn't anger she felt, she was used to this. In a way she wished she weren't, but something quieter, deeper, a sense of exhaustion, perhaps, or maybe it was resolve. As she drove away from Fairhaven, the quiet streets seemed unchanged. But something had shifted, however imperceptibly, for Jordan, for Ethan, for the town itself. The events of this day would not be easily forgotten. Fairhaven's streets were quieter than usual the next morning, though it was a silence filled with tension. Beneath the surface, the town was buzzing. At the corner cafe, where conversations usually centered on weekend plans or the best route to avoid traffic, there was only one topic of discussion. "Did you hear about the officer? Arrested an FBI agent, can you believe it?" whispered a man nursing his coffee. "They're saying she didn't do anything wrong," replied his companion, shaking his head. "Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Not far away, in the modest bungalow she called home, Carla Mendez listened to the murmurs of the town with quiet indignation. A longtime community organizer, Carla had seen firsthand how the unspoken rules of Fairhaven kept people in their places, rules that had nothing to do with laws and everything to do with perception. To her, this wasn't just an incident. It was a symptom of something deeper, something that had been ignored for too long. She stood at her kitchen counter, her hands gripping the edge as she read the news online. The headline was blunt: Fairhaven officer detains FBI agent in suspected case of racial profiling. Below it, the accompanying photo of Jordan Ellis stared back at her, composed but resolute. Carla sighed. She had seen that expression before on the faces of those who had endured what couldn't be said aloud, who had chosen to carry the burden instead of fighting back. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the weight of Jordan's title, or perhaps it was simply that the story had come to light. Whatever the reason, Carla knew this was a moment to act. Blank. At the precinct, the mood was subdued. Captain Rebecca Haynes had called a meeting with her senior officers, and the atmosphere in the small conference room was tense. A stack of files sat untouched on the table, but no one seemed eager to begin. Haynes stood at the head of the room, her hands resting on the back of a chair, her usual calm demeanor edged with frustration. "We're under scrutiny," she began, her voice steady but firm. "The department's actions, your actions, are being questioned. And frankly, I can't say I blame them." The officers exchanged glances. some defensive, others contemplative. Lieutenant Rosa Martinez spoke up first. "What's the plan, Captain? This isn't going to blow over." "No, it's not," Haynes replied. "And it shouldn't. We're going to cooperate fully with the investigation. Transparency is the only way forward." A younger officer, visibly uneasy, shifted in his seat. "And what about Tate?" he asked. "He's being hung out to dry for doing his job." Martinez's gaze sharpened. "His job? If profiling someone because they look out of place is part of the job, then maybe it's time we rethink what that job is." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Outside the precinct, the whispers were turning into something louder. A small group had gathered on the steps, holding signs that read "Justice for all" and "End profiling now." It wasn't a large crowd. Not yet, but it was enough to draw attention. Passers-by stopped to watch, some nodding in quiet agreement, others shaking their heads and muttering about how people always blow things out of proportion. Among the protesters was Malcolm Reed, a retired schoolteacher and a quiet but steady presence in the community. He had lived in Fairhaven for decades, long enough to see its facade of harmony crack more than once. As he held his sign, his voice calm but unwavering, he spoke to those who would listen. "This isn't just about one officer," he said to a woman who had paused to ask why he was there. "It's about a system that lets someone see a person and make assumptions based on nothing but the color of their skin." The woman frowned. "But isn't it possible he just made a mistake?" "It's possible," Malcolm said with a nod. "But why does it always seem like the mistakes happen to the same kind of people?" She didn't have an answer for that, and she walked away, her brow furrowed in thought. Blank. Underscore. Blank. At her office downtown, Jordan Ellis was preparing for what she knew would be a long battle. The incident had thrust her into the spotlight in a way she hadn't anticipated. And though she preferred to do her work quietly, she understood the importance of her role now. Her assistant, Aaron, stood in the doorway, tablet in hand. "You've got a request for an interview," Aaron said. "A few, actually. Local news, a couple of national outlets." Jordan glanced up from her desk, her expression measured. "Not yet. Let's see what the department does first." "Are you sure? This could be a chance to control the narrative." "I don't want to control the narrative," Jordan said. "I want the truth to speak for itself." Aaron hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." As the door closed, Jordan leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the countless stories she had heard during her career, stories from people who didn't have a badge to protect them, who didn't have the resources to fight back. Those stories had shaped her, and now they guided her. Blank. Underscore. Blank. By evening, the gathering outside the precinct had grown. Carla stood among them, her voice carrying over the crowd as she spoke into a megaphone. "This isn't just about what happened to Agent Ellis," she said. "This is about every time someone was stopped, questioned, or harassed for no reason other than how they look. It's about saying enough is enough." Malcolm stood nearby, nodding in agreement. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing down the quiet streets of Fairhaven. Inside the station, Ethan Tate sat in a corner of the locker room, his head in his hands. The voices outside filtered in faintly, a reminder of the storm he had caused. He didn't feel like a villain, but he also couldn't deny that he was the face of this controversy now. The truth was, he hadn't considered what it would feel like to be on the other side of the badge, to have his actions scrutinized, his motives questioned, and as he sat there, he wondered if he ever truly understood the weight of his authority. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Fairhaven, for all its calm and order, was a town built on quiet contradictions. It prided itself on its harmony, its sense of community, but beneath the surface were fractures that had always been there, waiting to be exposed. Now, those fractures were impossible to ignore. In the coming days, the protests would grow, the conversations would become louder, and for the first time in a long time, Fairhaven would be forced to reckon with the quiet, unspoken truths that had shaped it. For Jordan Ellis, Carla Mendez, and Malcolm Reed, this was only the beginning. For Ethan Tate, it was the start of a reckoning he hadn't anticipated. And for the town itself, It was a moment that would not soon be forgotten. The rhythms of Fairhaven continued as they always had. Cars rolled steadily along tree-lined streets. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors at the same time every morning. And neighbors exchanged greetings that rarely ventured beyond the weather. Yet, there was an undercurrent, a quiet shift that couldn't be ignored. People were talking, but not in the way they usually did. At the weekly farmers' market, where the smell of fresh produce mixed with the chatter of friendly exchanges, the topic of conversation had changed. Instead of recipes or gardening tips, it was the recent protests, the arrest of Agent Jordan Ellis, and what it all meant for Fairhaven. "Do you really think it's about race?" an older man asked, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. His companion, a woman with a weathered face and kind eyes, nodded slowly. "I do. Maybe not in the way people think. Though, it's not about hate, it's about assumptions. And we've all made them." The man frowned but said nothing more. The silence between them heavy with unspoken agreement. Blank. Underscore. Blank. For Ethan Tate, silence had become a constant companion. He spent his days at home. The television muted. His phone face down on the table to avoid the endless stream of calls and messages. The walls of his small apartment felt closer than ever, their stillness pressing in on him. He told himself he'd done nothing wrong, at least nothing intentional. But that defense rang hollow now. Even in the solitude of his own thoughts, Ethan replayed the encounter with Jordan Ellis in his mind, searching for the exact moment when he could have done things differently. There were too many to count. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, he found his former partner, Officer Greg Henson, standing there with an unreadable expression. "Thought I'd check in," Greg said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Ethan shrugged, gesturing vaguely toward the couch. "Not much to check on." Greg sat, his movements deliberate. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look," Greg began, his tone careful. "People are talking, Ethan. And not just about you." Ethan raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "They're talking about the department. About all of us. This isn't just about what happened, it's about what's been happening for years." "What's that supposed to mean?" Ethan asked, his voice defensive. Greg met his gaze, unflinching. "It means maybe it's time to start listening." Blank. Underscore. Blank. Across town, Jordan Ellis sat in her office. A stack of files spread across her desk. Each one told a story not hers. But stories like hers. People who had been stopped, questioned, detained, or worse, for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or, more accurately, being the wrong person in the wrong place. Her assistant, Aaron, stood in the doorway. The mayor's office called again. Aaron said, "They're requesting a meeting." Jordan didn't look up. "Schedule it. But not until next week. I want them to sweat a little." Aaron smirked. "Making them come to you?" "Something like that," Jordan replied. "This isn't just a PR problem for them, Aaron. It's a systemic one. And if they don't realize that, then we're wasting our time." Aaron nodded and left, leaving Jordan to her files. She picked up the next one, flipping through its contents with practiced precision. The stories blurred together after a while, each one a variation on the same theme. But this time, she paused. The complaint was from a young man who'd been stopped by Officer Tate 6 months ago. He'd been walking home from his part-time job when Ethan had pulled over, questioned him about his destination, and run his ID. Nothing had come of it. But the man's words in the report lingered. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. He just looked at me like I didn't belong." Jordan closed the file and leaned back in her chair. The patterns were clear, but the solutions felt elusive. She knew change wouldn't come easily. It never did. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Meanwhile, the protests outside the precinct had grown larger. Though they remained peaceful, Carla Mendez stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as a line of officers stood behind barricades, their faces unreadable. Among them was Lieutenant Rosa Martinez, her stance less rigid than the others. Carla approached her, stopping just short of the barricade. "You look like you're thinking about something," Carla said. Martinez glanced at her, her expression neutral. Always thinking. Good, Carla replied. Maybe you're one of the ones who gets it. Martinez tilted her head. Gets what? That this isn't about hating cops. Carla said. It's about making things better for everyone. Martinez didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out at the crowd. At the signs calling for justice and change. Not everyone sees it that way. Maybe not, Carla said, but some of you do. And that's enough to start. Blank. Blank. That evening, Fairhaven seemed to hold its breath as the sun set, casting long shadows over the town. In his apartment, Ethan stared at the badge he'd once worn with pride, now resting on the table in front of him. Across town, Jordan sat at her desk, drafting a plan for reform. And at the precinct, Rosa Martinez lingered after her shift, staring out the window at the empty street below. The fault lines in Fairhaven had always been there, invisible but undeniable. Now, they were impossible to ignore. The question wasn't whether they would hold or break but what would emerge when they finally shifted. Fairhaven carried on, its routines unbroken on the surface. The bakery opened at dawn, filling Main Street with the scent of fresh bread. Retirees gathered at the park, feeding ducks and reminiscing about simpler times. Yet, beneath the veneer of normalcy, something had shifted. The town was wrestling with itself, its unspoken rules and quiet assumptions laid bare for all to see. In the precinct, Lieutenant Rosa Martinez walked the familiar halls, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the early morning. She paused by the bulletin board where announcements, duty schedules, and commendations were pinned. Her eyes lingered on a flyer advertising a community engagement workshop, scheduled for the following week. The workshop was mandatory, a new initiative from Captain Rebecca Haynes in response to the protests. Rosa wondered how many officers would show up with open minds. She turned the corner and saw Ethan Tate, sitting in the waiting area, his head bowed. His suspension had kept him away for weeks. But today he was back for a meeting with Internal Affairs. He didn't look up as she approached. And she didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she studied him quietly, trying to discern whether he was grappling with regret or simply resentment. Blank. Across town, Jordan Ellis sat in a modest conference room at City Hall, her presence commanding even in silence. The mayor, a polished woman named Elaine Brooks, sat across from her, flanked by a small group of aides. Between them lay a stack of documents, proposals for reform, drafted by Jordan and her team. The tension in the room was palpable. These are ambitious, the mayor said, tapping the papers with her manicured nails. They're necessary, Jordan replied evenly. The mayor leaned back, her expression unreadable. You're asking a lot of this town. Of this department. I'm asking Fairhaven to live up to what it claims to be. Jordan said. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it carried a weight that made the aides glance at each other uncomfortably. The mayor's gaze softened, but only slightly. Not everyone will see it that way. They don't have to. Change doesn't wait for consensus. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then the mayor nodded, almost imperceptibly. We'll review it. Blank. The protests had begun to ebb, but the conversations they sparked continued. At the community center, a town hall meeting drew residents of all backgrounds. Some came to listen, others to vent. Malcolm Reed, the retired teacher, stood near the back, observing as voices rose and fell. A young mother spoke first. Her words careful but clear. I've lived here all my life. And I've always felt safe. But now I'm wondering, safe for who? A man in a plaid shirt, his arms crossed tightly, responded, his voice tinged with defensiveness. Are we really saying this town is racist? Because I don't see it. Maybe that's the problem. Malcolm interjected quietly. The room turned to him, his presence commanding respect. We don't see it because it doesn't happen to us. But that doesn't mean it isn't happening. His words hung in the air, unchallenged. Ethan's meeting with Internal Affairs was brief but heavy. The questions were pointed, the tone professional but cold. By the time he left, the weight on his shoulders had grown heavier. As he walked to his car, he noticed Malcolm standing nearby, holding a flyer for the next town hall. Officer Tate, Malcolm said, his tone even. Ethan hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge him. Mr. Reed, he said finally. Malcolm studied him for a moment. You ever been to one of these? He asked. Holding up the flyer. Ethan shook his head. I don't think I'd be welcome. Maybe not, Malcolm said, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't listen. Ethan didn't reply, but the words stayed with him as he drove home. Blank. Underscore. Blank. That evening, Jordan returned to her office. The city lights casting long shadows across her desk. She sat with a file open in front of her, another case of a resident stopped for suspicious behavior. Though nothing illegal had occurred, the pattern was so familiar it felt almost mundane. Yet it never ceased to frustrate her. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Carla Mendez. The mayor's office said they're moving forward with the first round of reforms. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. Jordan allowed herself a small smile. Progress was often painfully slow, but it was progress all the same. Blank. Underscore. Blank. In his apartment, Ethan stared at the badge he'd turned in weeks ago. It sat on the table like an artifact from another life. He thought about Malcolm's words. About the young mother at the town hall. And about Jordan Ellis, her calm voice cutting through the noise with precision. He didn't know what redemption looked like, or if it was even possible. But for the first time, he considered what it might mean to try. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Fairhaven's quiet reckoning wasn't dramatic or explosive. It unfolded in small, deliberate moments in conversations that lingered after meetings. In shifts of perspective that came slowly but steadily. The town was changing, though not all at once. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like those changes might last. Fairhaven's transformation wasn't dramatic. It unfolded slowly, like the first hints of spring after a long winter, subtle, nearly imperceptible, but undeniable. The protests had quieted, and the streets returned to their familiar rhythms. But the town's conversations were forever changed. At City Hall, the first community oversight board meeting was held in a small, unassuming conference room. The walls were lined with local artwork, an effort to make the space feel welcoming. Though the weight of the occasion was evident. Seated around the table were a mix of community leaders, legal experts, and a few retired officers. Jordan Ellis sat among them, her presence calm but commanding. The chair of the board, Deborah Hargrove, an attorney with a reputation for integrity, opened the meeting. We're here because the community demanded accountability, she said, her voice steady. This isn't about retribution, it's about rebuilding trust. The first case on the agenda involved an officer accused of excessive force during a routine traffic stop. A grainy dashcam video was played, the audio crackling with tension as the encounter escalated far beyond what seemed necessary. The room was silent as the footage ended. A board member, a retired judge, cleared his throat. It's clear there were errors in judgment here, he said, but the question is, what do we do about it? Jordan leaned forward, her voice measured. Accountability starts with acknowledgement. If we excuse this as a one-off mistake, we send a message that this behavior is tolerable. It isn't. The room nodded in agreement. And by the end of the session, the board had recommended disciplinary action for the officer and a review of departmental policies on use of force. It wasn't a sweeping victory, but it was a start. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Across town, Ethan Tate sat in his car outside the community center. The flyer for a town hall meeting crumpled in his hand. He had debated coming all afternoon, the weight of his own actions keeping him rooted in uncertainty. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish by being here, but he knew staying away felt worse. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet energy. Residents of all ages filled the seats, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to firm resolve. At the front of the room, Malcolm Reed and Carla Mendez prepared to moderate the discussion. Ethan slipped into a seat near the back, keeping his head down. The first speaker, a young woman, stood and shared her experience of being stopped while jogging in her own neighborhood. Her voice trembled as she described the humiliation of being treated like a suspect for no reason other than her appearance. I've lived here my whole life, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. But that day, I felt like I didn't belong. Ethan felt the words settle in his chest. Heavy and familiar. He'd heard similar stories before. But never like this, never directly from the people who lived them. Malcolm spoke next. His tone calm but firm. What we're talking about isn't new. It's been here, simmering under the surface. The difference now is that we're not ignoring it anymore. Ethan looked around the room, noticing the nods of agreement, the quiet murmurs of affirmation. For the first time, he understood how deeply the issues ran, how many people had been affected. Not just by individual actions but by a system that allowed those actions to go unchecked. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later that evening, Jordan sat on a park bench. Her thoughts heavy but purposeful. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. Carla joined her, sitting quietly for a moment before speaking. Did you hear about Tate showing up at the town hall? Carla asked. Jordan nodded. I did. What do you make of it? Jordan considered the question carefully. People can change, Carla, but change isn't about words. It's about what you do when no one's watching. Carla smiled faintly. Sounds like something Malcolm would say. Maybe he's rubbing off on me. Jordan replied. They sat in companionable silence, the sounds of the town humming softly in the background. For all its flaws, Fairhaven felt different now, less certain in its assumptions, but more willing to question them. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The next morning, Ethan found himself outside the precinct. Not as an officer but as a participant in the newly mandated training sessions. The room was small and sparsely decorated, with chairs arranged in a circle. Lieutenant Rosa Martinez led the session, her demeanor professional but approachable. This isn't about assigning blame, she began. It's about understanding the impact of our actions, intentional or not. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, some crossing their arms, others avoiding eye contact. Ethan sat quietly, listening as Martinez walked them through scenarios designed to highlight implicit bias and its consequences. One exercise involved a series of photos, faces of different ages, races, and expressions. The task was simple: describe the person based on their appearance. The responses varied, but as the session progressed, the patterns became clear. Assumptions were being made, often unconsciously. Afterward, Martinez addressed the group. This isn't about making you feel guilty. It's about making you aware. Because awareness is the first step toward change. Ethan stayed behind after the session, approaching Martinez as she packed up her materials. Do you think people really change? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. Martinez looked at him, her expression thoughtful. I think people can change if they're willing to look at themselves honestly. The question is, are you? Ethan didn't respond, but the question stayed with him as he left. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Fairhaven wasn't fixed overnight. The changes were small, incremental, a new oversight policy here, a training session there, but they were changes nonetheless. For Jordan, the work was far from over. She knew progress wasn't linear, that every step forward would come with resistance. But as she walked through the town, she saw glimmers of hope in the faces of its people. For Ethan, the path was less clear. Redemption, if it was even possible, would be slow and unsteady. But for the first time, he was beginning to see the road ahead not as a return to what he'd been, but as a chance to become something better. And for Fairhaven, the shadows of its past lingered, but they no longer went unacknowledged. The town was changing, one quiet reckoning at a time. The first whispers of autumn crept into Fairhaven as the days grew shorter and the air carried a faint chill. The trees lining the town's quiet streets were just beginning to show their colors, their leaves a patchwork of green and gold. The rhythm of life had resumed its steady beat. But beneath it, the conversations continued. In the precinct's modest conference room, the Civilian Oversight Board was in session. The cases they reviewed were not sensational, no-breaking headlines or dramatic arrests, but they carried weight nonetheless. They were the quiet stories of bias, of split-second decisions that revealed deeper truths about the systems in place. Deborah Hargrove, the board's chair, presided over the meeting with her usual calm authority. Across the table sat Jordan Ellis, her notebook open, pen poised. They were discussing the department's new body camera policy. a direct result of community demands for greater transparency. This is a good start, Jordan said, flipping through the policy draft. But without proper oversight, it's just another piece of equipment. Deborah nodded. Agreed. That's why we're recommending random audits and mandatory reviews for incidents flagged by the community. The others murmured in assent, their focus unwavering. There was no room for half measures. Not anymore. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Ethan Tate stood outside the community center, the early evening light casting long shadows across the pavement. The building buzzed with quiet activity as residents gathered for a forum on police-community relations. Ethan wasn't sure why he had come. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps a desire to feel connected to something bigger than himself. Whatever the reason, he found himself stepping inside. The room was arranged in a circle, the chairs filled with people of all ages and backgrounds. At the center was Malcolm Reed, his calm presence a steadying force. He began by inviting participants to share their experiences, good, bad, or somewhere in between. A middle-aged man spoke first, recounting a time when an officer had gone out of their way to help his family after a car accident. The story was met with nods of approval, but it didn't last long. A young woman followed, her voice trembling as she described being pulled over for driving too carefully. I wasn't speeding, she said, her eyes darting around the room. But he kept asking me where I was going, why I was in that neighborhood. I felt small. The room grew quiet, her words hanging in the air like an unfinished question. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. Malcolm cleared his throat, his voice even. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a larger pattern. One that we can only address if we're willing to listen. Ethan looked up, meeting Malcolm's eyes for the first time. He nodded slightly. A gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. But Malcolm saw it, and he nodded back. Blank. Underscore. Blank. At her office, Jordan sat at her desk, her laptop open to a draft of a speech she would give at an upcoming forum. The cursor blinked steadily as she considered her words. The balance was always delicate, too soft. And the message might be lost, too sharp. And it might alienate those she needed to reach. Her husband, Samuel, appeared in the doorway, a mug of tea in hand. He set it on her desk without a word, his quiet presence a reminder that she didn't have to carry this alone. You've been at this all day, he said gently. It's okay to step back for a moment. Jordan sighed, leaning back in her chair. I know, but it feels like if I stop, even for a second, we might lose the momentum. Samuel sat in the chair across from her, his gaze steady. Momentum doesn't come from one person. Jordan, you've already sparked something bigger than yourself. Let others carry it forward too. She smiled faintly, her resolve softening. You always know what to say. It's a gift, he replied with a wink, earning a quiet laugh from her. Blank. Underscore. Blank. In the precinct, Lieutenant Rosa Martinez gathered her officers for another training session. The room was filled with a mix of faces, some eager, some skeptical, and a few openly resistant. Rosa addressed them with her usual directness. This isn't about politics, she began, pacing slowly. It's about doing our jobs better. If you're here to check a box and move on, you're in the wrong place. One officer raised a hand. Lieutenant, how are we supposed to do our jobs when every decision is second-guessed? Rosa stopped, meeting his gaze evenly. If your decisions are grounded in fairness and respect, they'll hold up to scrutiny. And if they're not, then maybe they should be second-guessed. The room fell silent, her words leaving no room for argument. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the town hall forum ended, Ethan lingered outside, watching as people filed out into the cool night air. Malcolm approached him, his steps measured. You didn't have to stay, Malcolm said. I wanted to, Ethan replied. He hesitated, then added, I needed to. Malcolm nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's a start. Ethan looked away, the weight of his own shortcomings pressing down on him. I'm not sure what comes next. None of us are, Malcolm said, but the important thing is that you're here, willing to listen. That's more than some can say. Ethan nodded, his gratitude unspoken but understood. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Fairhaven's journey was far from over. Its transformation incomplete. But in the quiet moments at community meetings, in training rooms, in late-night conversations, it was clear that something had changed. The town was no longer content to let its unspoken rules go unchallenged. For Jordan, for Ethan, for Malcolm and Rosa, the work continued. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was steady, like the changing of the seasons. Small steps forward, one after another, toward a future that was still uncertain but worth striving for. Autumn had fully settled over Fairhaven. The golden light of late afternoon cast long shadows across the streets. And the first hints of a chill whispered through the air. It was the kind of evening that begged for stillness. For reflection, Jordan Ellis stood on the steps of the community center, looking out over the park where families gathered. Children laughed as they chased each other through the fallen leaves, their joy unrestrained. It was a simple scene, unremarkable to most. But for Jordan, it held meaning. This was the same town that had felt so divided not long ago. The same town where assumptions had nearly cost her more than her pride. Now, it felt different, not perfect, not healed, but mending. Blank. Blank. Inside the community center, a celebration was underway, small, modest, and heartfelt. The Civilian Oversight Board had marked its first year of existence. And tonight was a moment to reflect on what had been accomplished. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, punctuated by laughter and the clinking of coffee cups. Deborah Hargrove addressed the crowd first, her tone steady and deliberate. "What we've done over the past year is only the beginning," she said. "Accountability isn't a destination. It's a process, one we must continue to nurture. Together." The applause was warm, though not overly enthusiastic. It wasn't the kind of evening for grand gestures. The people in the room knew the weight of the work ahead. But they also understood the significance of what had already been done. Blank. Ethan Tate lingered near the back of the room, unsure if he belonged. He hadn't been invited specifically. But no one had turned him away either. He watched as Jordan spoke. Her words calm but firm. "This town has shown that change is possible," she said. "Not because of any one person, but because a community came together to demand better." Ethan felt the truth of her words. He thought about the young woman who had spoken at the town hall, about the faces in the training sessions he had attended, about Malcolm Reed's quiet encouragement. He wasn't sure he deserved to be here, but he stayed anyway. Blank. Later, as the crowd thinned, Ethan found himself outside the community center, standing awkwardly near the steps. Jordan emerged, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders. She noticed him immediately and approached, her expression unreadable. "Officer Tate," she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. "Just Ethan," he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. He hesitated, then added, "I don't know if this means much, but I'm sorry for everything." Jordan studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. "It does mean something," she said finally, "but words are only the start." "I know," Ethan said. I want to do better." Jordan nodded, a small but genuine gesture. "Then start by listening. And keep listening." Ethan nodded, watching as she turned and walked away, her figure fading into the evening shadows. He felt lighter, though he couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was because, for the first time, he had begun to let go of the person he had been. Blank. Fairhaven wasn't a different town. Not entirely. There were still disagreements, still moments of tension, but there was also a willingness to look inward, to question the quiet biases that had gone unspoken for so long. At the precinct, Rosa Martinez led another training session, her voice calm but firm. She could see the slow shift in her colleagues, the way some of them began to approach their work with a new kind of care. Not all of them. Of course, change was never universal, but it was enough to matter. At the Oversight Board, Deborah continued her steady leadership, guiding the team through complex cases and difficult conversations. The work was tedious, often thankless, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. And for Jordan, the road ahead was still long. She continued to speak at forums, to draft policies, to advocate for reform not just in Fairhaven but in places like it across the country. Her work was far from finished, but she carried it with a quiet determination. Blank. Underscore. Blank. One crisp morning, Jordan found herself walking through the park again. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8, approached her, clutching a notebook. Her face lit up with recognition. "Are you the lady from TV?" the girl asked, her voice full of curiosity. Jordan smiled. "I've been on TV a few times. You talk about making things fair," the girl said, her small brow furrowed in thought. "I like that." Jordan knelt to meet her gaze. "What's your name?" "Amelia," the girl replied. "Well, Amelia," Jordan said, her tone soft but sincere. "It's people like you who help make things fair. It starts with asking questions. Just like you're doing now." The girl nodded solemnly, as though receiving instructions for an important mission. Jordan smiled as Amelia skipped back to her parents, her notebook clutched tightly. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The transformation of Fairhaven wasn't the kind of story that made headlines after the first wave of outrage passed. It was quieter, slower, a shift in the way people saw themselves and each other. It was the work of countless small moments, a conversation, a policy, a choice to see someone differently. For Jordan, for Ethan, for Rosa, and for the town itself. The journey was far from over. But as the leaves turned and the season shifted, there was hope, a quiet, steady hope that Fairhaven was becoming a place where everyone could belong.